Chapter 35, The Cat Hysterectomy. The next year, Eddie took one of those advanced biology classes. He worked on a month-long project on rats. First, he learned how to anesthetize them with a little cylinder of cardboard that had an ether-soaked cotton ball in it. Next, he learned how to operate on them. His experiment involved hormone-related physiological changes. What that meant was he had to neuter both a male and a female rat, and after a few weeks put them down and do an autopsy to reveal what changes had occurred. It sounded pretty straightforward when the professor explained it to them, but when the moment came to euthanize his rats, Eddie struggled. He managed to go through with it, and even made a good grade, but he determined he'd rather operate on rats than kill them any day. When he got home to West Virginia that summer, he was met by his brother Jimmy. "Eddie, I've got bad news," he said. "Dad says my cat, Tigger, is having too many babies, and he's going to have to do something about it." Now, something about it on a farm usually involved a gunny sack and the river. Eddie looked up at the sky and stroked his chin. His mind was whirling. He thought about his biology experiment and his little brother's predicament. Rat, cat, how different could they be? "Jimmy," he said in his most reassuring way, "I can help you. I've been off to school, and I've learned a thing or two. Give me a few days to gather my equipment, and we'll fix Tigger right up." A few days later, Eddie rode to Madison, the county seat, with his folks, and he made a stop at the drugstore. Did they have a can of ether they would sell a 16-year-old? "Of course. What else can we do for you?" Looking back on it, it does make you wonder. Well, when Eddie got home, he rounded up an old fish tank and an unused refrigerator rack. He found a piece of plywood that would work as a cover for the tank, and then he made sure his mother's sewing kit was well supplied and asked to borrow the hair clippers. All was in place, so he waited until his folks were conveniently away one Saturday morning, and he assembled his brothers. "Boys," he said, "we've got a problem. Dad is going to have to do something to Tigger if she keeps having so many kittens. But I've got a plan. Go get your bathrobes." When the boys got back, Eddie had them put the robes on backwards, like surgeons, and cover their mouths with one of their dad's handkerchiefs. He spread a bedsheet over the dining room table and hoisted the old fish tank onto it. He poured a few splashes of ether inside, lowered the refrigerator rack onto the wooden blocks, and readied the plywood lid. "Get Tigger," he said, and Greg and Gray raced off to produce the cat. She was lowered into the tank, and Eddie capped the lid in place. Tigger looked a bit worried as she stared at the boys through the glass, but not for long. After a few seconds, she started to get sleepy and then lay down, unconscious. The boys pulled her limp form from the tank and spread her gently on the bed sheet. "Jimmy," said Eddie, "this is your cat, so I'm giving you the most critical job. You're to be the anesthetist. You see this cone with the cotton ball in the end? It's got ether on it. You have to carefully watch this cat and adjust the airflow. If Tigger starts to breathe fast, you pull the cone up closer over her face. If she starts to breathe slowly, you pull it back so she can get more oxygen. You got it?" Jimmy nodded, deadly serious. He really loved his cat, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Next, the hair clippers were produced, and Tigger was carefully shaved down both sides of her body. The boys swabbed alcohol on the incision sites and then produced their mother's sewing scissors. Eddie made a 3-inch incision down her right side and began to carefully probe, looking for her ovaries. He gently moved organs around until he located the uterus. Following it up, he came to the fallopian tube, which led to the right ovary. So far, so good. Taking a piece of white sewing thread, he carefully tied off the ovarian artery and then made a clip with scissors. Lifting his head and smiling triumphantly, he held the ovary aloft. "That's one," he said. "Now for the other. Jimmy, you okay?" Jimmy nodded, just a bit woozily from bending over the ether cone so intently. The boys returned to the sewing kit and found a needle to stitch up Tigger's right side. Then they gently flipped her over and made the second incision. Again, Eddie poked and probed. He asked for more light. The clock ticked and timed passed. After a half hour had gone by, Eddie was beginning to feel lightheaded as well. He looked everywhere and had not been able to locate Tigger's left ovary. Maybe his assumption that rats and cats were the same had been a bit optimistic. After another 15 minutes, Eddie made a tactical decision. Ovary or no ovary, it was time to close Tigger up. They stitched her left side together and removed the ether cone. The minutes dragged by as they waited for signs of life. Finally, Tigger blinked and let out a weak meow. Eddie popped an aspirin in her mouth and rubbed her throat until she swallowed. Then the boys put her in a box with a soft towel in the bottom and laid her in a dark corner to recover. And all was well. For about 3 days. Then Jimmy came running to Eddie, his eyes open wide. "It's Tigger," he gasped. "She's chewed her stitches out. What are we going to do?" he cried. Eddie looked at the ground and felt like swearing. This hadn't happened in the lab. Well, there was only one thing to do. Fortunately, his parents happened to be away. The bathrobes went back on, the handkerchiefs were tied, the tank produced an ether splashed. Only this time, something was different. Tigger had the same worried look on her face, perhaps even more so than the last time. Experience has a way of teaching even cats a thing or two. But as she got drowsy, the boys saw she was having a strange reaction to the ether. It was producing a thick mucus that drooled from her open mouth. Although she was slobbering profusely, Tigger eventually dropped into a deep sleep. Jimmy managed the anesthesia again, and the boys went straight to the sewing basket for a needle and thread. There's a big difference between stitching a piece of cloth and suturing cat hide. The needle didn't want to go through. So Eddie called for pliers and soldiered on. After a half hour, he finished sewing up one side and flipped Tigger over, avoiding the puddle of thick mucus around her head. But the second side proved even more difficult than the first. Minutes were ticking by, and everyone was growing tired. Just then, Jimmy looked down at Tigger and yelled, "She's not breathing!" Sure enough, Tigger was lying as still as death. Perhaps Jimmy had left the cone on too long. The boys started to panic. "Don't worry," Eddie shouted. "I know what to do." Pulling an old toilet paper tube from his back pocket, he placed his homemade resuscitator over Tigger's face and started to blow. She began to inflate like a fuzzy gray balloon. All the old movies used to say, "In with the good air, out with the bad," but the bad air didn't seem to want to come out. Seconds were ticking by. "Eddie," yelled Jimmy, "do something! She's going to have brain damage!" So Eddie pressed down on Tigger's ribs. Nothing. He pressed harder. Still nothing. If he pressed much harder, he'd pop the stitches he'd worked so hard to put in. It was time for a desperate move. Eddie bent back over the still form of Tigger and put his mouth on the end of the toilet paper tube. He took a deep breath and then sucked back on the resuscitator with all his might. At that moment, a hairball covered with thick mucus broke loose. It traveled the length of the tube and struck Eddie square in the back of the throat. He staggered backward, crushing the toilet paper tube in his fist, and collapsed in the corner of the dining room. He struggled for air. When he could speak, he looked up at the circle of staring faces. "That cat will die before I do that again," he said with conviction. Jimmy went pale and turned to the limp form of his beloved cat lying helpless on the table. "Tigger!" he cried. Then, without thinking of himself, he placed his mouth over the slobbery jaws of his cat and began to give her repeated puffs of air. Miraculously, she coughed and then began to take wheezy breaths. She was alive! Looking down at the last remaining stitch, the boys made a quality decision. They decided that Tigger would just have to figure that one out for herself. They weren't going to put her back through the anesthesia again. They gave her the aspirin and tucked her into her box in the corner. 2 days later, Jimmy came panting up to Eddie again. "She's done it again," he said. "She's chewed her stitches out." "Well, I'm done with her," said Eddie. "If she makes it, fine. If she doesn't, she's no worse off than she would have been." Believe it or not, that cat healed up as if nothing had ever happened to her. Who knows how many of her 9 lives she used in the ordeal, but Jimmy was thrilled to have her safe and sound, or almost. The following spring, Tigger gave birth to one little striped kitten. When the boy's dad found her and the kitten in the barn, he remembered his promise. But as he looked into Tigger's eyes, he noticed a mysterious expression. She looked as if she'd suffered great misery. Scratching his head, the boy's dad decided he could overlook one little kitten. Tigger would be allowed to live.